They tried a key on my front door one night, not someone breaking in from the street, not some masked stranger, but the HOA president, calm as a social call, with a key that fit where it had no right to fit. I opened the door, and there she was on my porch, like she'd come to borrow sugar. And that moment snapped everything into focus. The person who ran our community had access to the one thing we thought was private. If you'd told me a year ago that the person in charge of our neighborhood's rules would be the one undermining them, I'd have laughed. Now I spend nights waking at the sound of footsteps. My name's Frank Mercer. I spent 30 years in network security, not the flashy kind you see in movies, but the patient, stubborn sort of work where patterns reveal themselves if you stop treating the world like noise and start treating it like data. After retirement, I moved to Willow Ridge because I wanted quiet, a tidy lawn, a cup of coffee on a Tuesday morning that didn't have surprise emails attached. Lorraine Blackwood was the kind of neighbor you expect in a HOA newsletter. Polished, charitable at luncheons, the face in photos at community fundraisers. She chaired the board for 8 years, wore a blazer like armor, and smiled like she owned the map of our little town. What I didn't know was that smiling can be a strategy, and that strategy had a price. At first it was small things. A garden tool moved an inch, a box slightly shifted in the garage, the spare key I kept under a fake rock missing for a day. People misplace things, right? But then Dana down the street, ex-military, keeps the kind of watchful calm you only get from having been somewhere worse, found her front gate propped open in the morning, mud on the threshold where there shouldn't have been any, and a contractor she'd never hired on the driveway. We started talking, neighbors and kitchen lights and late-night texts, trading timestamps and video clips from door cams. The pattern emerged overnight. The same delivery trucks, the same contractor vans, the same brief window of entry between midnight and dawn. They weren't random thieves. They were doing reconnaissance. You learn to read people when you've spent your life parsing signals. Lorraine's meetings started to look different. The HOA meetings became less about landscaping and more about who needed access where. She argued for a master access policy ostensibly to help contractors and do routine checks, and everyone nodded, because who doesn't trust a leader who uses words like efficiency and safety? But the key wasn't for efficiency. The key was for convenience, and convenience for some people looks an awful lot like opportunity for others. One afternoon, Dana and I sat in my living room with mismatched mugs and a laptop. The footage we pulled together was messy, grainy, annoying, the kind of video most folks toss, but it painted a map. A silhouette in a blue jacket carrying a toolbox in 3 different yards over 2 weeks, a van with a local security decal that didn't check out in any registry, a man with a hoodie who paused at one mailbox and then avoided every camera. It was deliberate. And when I cross-referenced HOA maintenance logs with the visits, the maintenance visits matched up with properties that had something missing within 48 hours. Not everything, not always, but always enough to be a pattern. When I confronted Lorraine in the community center, she'd set up the folding chairs in a perfect semicircle. As if we were at an easy civics seminar, she smiled and said, "Frank, you worry too much." The thing about smiling is that it fills the room up and pushes everything else to the edges. I told her about the footage. She laughed, the kind of laugh that becomes sharper when it's questioned, and said, "We have to trust our vendors. These are tough times. People make mistakes. There's a way to say that when you're trying to close a file on someone else's misdeeds," and Lorraine said it like a professional closer wipes a check. She'd always been good at controlling the narrative. But control is not proof, and proof is everything. So I did what I do. I followed a breadcrumb trail of receipts and timestamps, nudged open the corners of digital records, and found a pattern of payouts that didn't align with any legitimate contractor work. Lorraine had pushed through emergency funds for urgent repairs, small amounts spread across accounts, unremarkable in isolation, obscene in aggregate. A transfer to a shell company, then to a man with a record for fencing stolen property in the next county. Motive revealed itself like an ugly bloom: gambling debts, a mortgage on a multi-million-dollar property downtown, and an insistence at board meetings that we cut costs to compensate. She'd been using her position to authorize access, and in the process a ring had formed contractors on the payroll of people who had found a way to monetize keys. Once you've seen how something works, you can't unknow it. The worst part was how methodical it all was, like a machine that had been tuned by someone who understood systems. Lorraine wasn't a petty thief, she was an organizer. She routed information about vulnerable houses, who had safes, who kept jewelry, whose home offices stored backups for small businesses. She made lists and used the master access to test locks, to see what was keepable, what was sellable, and which neighbors were too watchful to bother with. The real betrayal was not the theft, it was that she weaponized trust. She turned the rules meant to protect us into cover for her own profit. There was a moment when things escalated. A late-night text to my phone. Anonymous, simple, mind your own house. Threats are crude, but they're effective in reality because they're human. They made it personal. When Dana found a surveillance jammer in her shed, we stopped attributing things to coincidence. When a safe in the next cul-de-sac was pried with surgical care, no signs of a messy break-in, just an expert hand, someone had professional help. That's when Marcus, my neighbor and a retired detective, stepped in. He'd kept a badge in a drawer long after the department retired him, and he started talking in the even sentences of someone who'd followed criminals for years. They're cleaning houses, he said, but they're also collecting vulnerabilities. This isn't joyriding. It's intelligence. We staged a small sting because what else do you do when the institution meant to protect you is compromised? Lorraine's pattern relied on predictability: sign logs, scheduled maintenance windows, the assumption that people wouldn't dare question the face of the HOA. So we fed unpredictability into the machine. Dana posed as a homeowner with an old, supposedly valuable hard drive stored in a secure box. Marcus arranged with a local private investigator to fake a shed full of antiques left unattended. I set up cameras where cameras shouldn't be, and we let the noise in the network settle while we watched. The night it happened, my hands were steady in a way I hadn't been since I left the office. There's this awful calm before a storm where the world is only the heartbeat of the watch on your wrist. A van rolled down our street. Same make as in the clips, same security decal, but there was no contractor name this time, just tinted windows and a driver who didn't bother to smile. Two men stepped out, quick and businesslike, and they moved like people who thought the keys gave them a right. Dana watched from behind a curtain, Marcus in his car with the lights off, and I stayed in the house where my cameras could pick them up without being seen. They tried the gate, then the door marked for emergency access. The black ring around the keyhole made it clear they'd been here before. They didn't expect Marcus. He stepped out from the shadows with his badge and the kind of motion that says you're about to ruin a plan. One of the men reached for a tool, a reflex of someone who makes a living in quick thefts, and Marcus was quicker, verbal authority kicking in, hands where I can see them. Lorraine pulled up in her car, that same composed look replaced with a face that folded into something like anger, then calculation. We'd caught the crew in the act, and with them a ledger of names and dates that tied back to her approvals. There's a small cinema in my head that plays the scene back, Lorraine, silent for a heartbeat, then snapping. You think you can embarrass me? I said, quiet and steady. No, Lorraine. We think you betrayed us. Her sharp retort, you're moralizing without facts, landed like someone knocking over a glass. The thing about public figures is they learn to speak into silence. Lorraine had learned to sculpt doubt out of a roomful of nods. But we had more than words. We had transfers, timestamps, vendor invoices that matched bail receipts, and online gambling accounts. We had the men in the van with tools and empty hands. Law enforcement took over after that night. There were interviews and subpoenas, and the kind of paperwork that takes the emotional heat out of things while it builds the legal fire. Lorraine was arrested, and the more the investigators peeled back, the more they found: a network of small-time crooks, a set of shell companies, and an impressive ability to keep a civic mask in place while private violence played out behind locked doors. The community felt both vindicated and hollow. The betrayal had been by someone who'd owned our trust, and trusting again is never simple. In the weeks after, Willow Ridge changed in small, functional ways. We instituted a true access audit, changed locks, brought in independent contractors vetted by a rotating committee. We held a town hall that felt like a small confession. People admitted they'd turned a blind eye because Lorraine had seemed competent, because confronting leadership is messy, because denial is easier than shame. Dana organized neighborhood watches with real training, Marcus volunteered to run compliance checks, and I built a small security playbook for neighbors who wanted it. The work was quieter than the headlines and more effective. But the last line of the story isn't tidy, and that's deliberate. In the months that followed, An encrypted email arrived in my junk folder, a blurred photo attached of a map that had pins where our cameras were. No words, just a suggestion that someone had noticed our rearrangement. We dismantled the operation. We could see the men, the shell accounts, Lorraine's accounts, but the appetite that powered it, the warmth of easy money and the willingness to weaponize trust didn't dissolve overnight. That ambiguity is what keeps me awake sometimes. We won this battle, but the war for community trust is ongoing. So what do you do with a story like this? You keep your eyes open, you ask why someone who wants power needs to keep doors unlocked, and you make rules that can't be bent by charm. You teach your neighbors to look, to speak, and to document. And you remember that community isn't a logo on stationery, it's the work of people who are willing to say, that's not right, even when saying it is the harder thing. I want to know what you think. Was Lorraine a monster, or a symptom of a system that rewards secrecy? Do you trust the institutions in your life, or do you think we're all just a key away from someone deciding what's private and what's profit? Drop a comment below, share if this hit home, and tell me, what would you do if you saw someone you trusted using your rules against you?